This is the brand new Honor Magic 8 Pro. This is the Oppo Find X9 Pro. And this is the Vivo X300 Pro. And in this video, we're going to compare the photo and video capabilities of these three top-tier camera phones. Let's get started.
Hey friends, this video was translated using AI, so the sound quality isn't the best. If you want to listen to the original sound from the smartphones and hear the audio recording test, just follow the link to our original video in the description.
Well friends, all the smartphones are charged to 100%. Let's go filming. Well friends, as always, we have our first test. It's the front-facing camera, 4K, 60 frames per second. We're filming in challenging conditions. As always, we have a sunset behind us. Now we'll see how our smartphones perform. When shooting against the light, we see that the Honor has the most blooming. The sky is completely washed out. You can just barely make out the sky in the center with the Oppo. But the Vivo has the best situation. There are also differences in color reproduction. The image on the left is the most overexposed, pale with a yellowish skin tone. The video in the center is more saturated and contrasty with a reddish skin tone. Vivo produces a tan skin tone, and the image is the most contrasty and darker than the competitors. When shooting in bright light, the Magic 8 Pro produces the lightest and palest image, with a yellowish tint. The video is more saturated and contrasty in the center and to the right. However, the Find X9 Pro video is warm, while the X300 Pro is relatively cool. As for image quality, there are no noticeable differences between the videos yet. All three offer very good detail. In the stabilization test, Oppo performed very unsteadily. It's positioned in the center of the tripod, and it should have an advantage, but it exhibits considerable shaking. Vivo isn't coping very confidently either, whereas Honor shows a quite stable result. Okay, it's actually really convenient that all three of these smartphones have a great front-facing camera. You can record at 0.8, 1x, and 2x. I'm recording at 0.8x now. And I'm just gonna switch to 1x. So the image will zoom in a little like this. And like this. The front-facing zoom feature isn't new, but it's nice to see it on all three smartphones. As we can see, the zoom change doesn't affect the color reproduction or video quality, so we won't dwell on it in detail. And the Honor Magic 8 Pro doesn't have a 2x option. So basically, I can only enable 0.8x and 1x. Oppo and Vivo can shoot at 2x. Switching to 2x gives us a very close-up view, allowing us to see the differences in video quality. It's noticeable that the image on the right is sharper and clearer, with more detail. For example, Vivo renders the wrinkles on the forehead and stubble better. And now I've activated HDR on the Honor and HDR on the Oppo. On the Vivo X300 Pro, I've enabled Dolby Vision. This is the kind of image we get when shooting against the light. I want to say a few words about the audio recording right away. For some reason, Vivo's recording sounds very compressed, but we'll do a separate audio test later. When shooting with extended dynamic range against the light, we get three different images. Vivo, due to a lower exposure, renders the sky better, but the foreground is quite dark as a result. Oppo, on the other hand, has a higher exposure, resulting in more blown-out highlights, but the foreground looks normal. Honor's background is completely blown out, and the foreground is overexposed. When shooting in bright light from the left, we see the brightest and most washed-out result. In the center, the image is more saturated and the warmest, while on the right it's darker and cooler. Well friends, and now we have portrait video with background blur. Unfortunately, Honor doesn't have this mode on the front camera. It seems like they used to, but I'm not sure. I think Honor has never had this mode on its front camera. Meanwhile, Oppo and Vivo offer a full portrait mode with background blur. That is, when the background is beautifully blurred. At the same time, the Oppo only offers 4K at 30 frames per second, which is still pretty good for the front-facing camera. However, with the Vivo, we can record video like this at 4K 60 frames per second. Here, we again hear a very compressed and unpleasant sound on the Vivo, whereas our competitors have a more natural-sounding audio. As for video, the X300 Pro looks more favorable thanks to smoother visuals at 60 FPS. The blurring on the Oppo and Vivo looks similar. For example, both struggle with fine hair and render it blurry. But that's a normal result for a front-facing camera. And overall, the blurring edges look quite neat. The Find X9 Pro performed very poorly in the stabilization test, even despite being centered on the tripod. The Vivo has less shake, although I still can't call the result ideal. As for the front-facing camera specs, they are quite similar. The Honor has a 50-megapixel lens with an f2.0 aperture and a 1/2.93-inch sensor. The Oppo Find X9 Pro is equipped with a similar module with the same resolution and aperture, but the sensor size is slightly larger, 1/2.76 inches. The Vivo X300 Pro, in turn, received an absolutely identical front-facing camera. Even the sensor size is the same as the Oppo's. By the way, friends, let's immediately note what operating system versions we have installed at the time of filming the tests. Future software updates might fix or change some issues in shooting modes, so that's a really important point. Friends, now we have a sound recording test in very challenging conditions. When there's a powerful road behind you, a 5-lane road, 3 lanes in one direction, and right behind me, there's another 2-lane road. That is, the cars are driving very loudly. There's also a very powerful construction site right behind me here. Vivo handled the audio recording surprisingly well under these challenging conditions. On it, the voice seems to stand out from the noise. It sounds isolated. Honor and Oppo's audio blends too much with the noise, and I'm not heard as clearly. Now I've activated voice enhancement, meaning when the smartphone should record my voice as clearly as possible. There's construction going on behind me, right behind me. I can hear the noise interrupting me. It will be very interesting to see if our smartphones can handle such difficult conditions. And now let's check the audio recording. 1, 2, 3, sound check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, sound check. In voice amplification mode, all 3 smartphones have very aggressive noise reduction. While the noise does decrease, the resulting audio quality is very unpleasant and compressed. If I had to choose which one has the most normal result, I'd say Oppo has a slightly clearer voice. The high frequencies are less cut. The most compressed and boomy result is from Vivo. Friends, now we're recording with the main camera block in 4K 60 FPS and recording with the ultra-wide lens. It's clear to the eye that the Honor has a wider viewing angle than Oppo and Vivo. There's a difference in color reproduction. The sides of the video are quite cold, while the center is warm. Another thing I'd note is the shaking of the image with the Oppo, even when simply walking. When running, the shaking intensifies, and Oppo again provides the weakest stabilization, despite its more advantageous positioning on the tripod. Here's what the video looks like when recording yourself with the ultra-wide camera in 4K 60 FPS. The recording is taken with the main camera block. When taking selfies, we get results that are very similar to the picture from the front-facing camera. Honor yellows the image. Oppo produces a warm picture with a reddish skin tone. Vivo's image is the darkest, with tan skin. All 3 handle backlighting quite well, but in slightly different ways. In the video's center frame, we see the least amount of lens flare, but the foreground is the darkest. To the right, the lens flare is a bit stronger, but I am also more visible. Honor produced the brightest result, which gives us a well-lit foreground, but also more significant lens flare from the sun. During the run, the Magic 8 Pro performed the most confidently. Vivo performed slightly worse. There's noticeable blur, and with Oppo, we see the most significant shaking again. Okay, so now we have the 1x lens. It's recording everything around us in 4K 60 FPS. When shooting everything around with the main lens, I can say that Honor delivers the most saturated image, and Oppo provides the calmest result in the center. Otherwise, no other noticeable differences are visible. Regarding stabilization, all 3 perform confidently and roughly equally. I've just activated the main lens now. This is 4K 60 FPS. Here's what my face looks like when I'm recording myself against the light. When filming yourself, you can see that Honor oversaturates the image, while Oppo and Vivo try to balance the color reproduction even in bright sunlight, and to make skin tones look more natural. We also see frame drops, which makes the video look choppy. We checked the original footage, and it genuinely came out like that on its own. It's not a rendering or editing software problem. Let's go back to color reproduction. When shooting against the light, the X300 Pro and Find X9 Pro behave very similarly. They reduce the overall exposure to reveal the sky, but the foreground becomes dark, especially in the central video footage. Conversely, the Magic 8 Pro keeps the focus on the foreground, and I'm clearly visible, but the background ends up overexposed due to the higher exposure. As for the stabilization test, all 3 performed confidently again, and I can't pick a standout. Now we're recording everything around us at 2x to test the video digital stabilization. All 3 smartphones handle walking well. I can only note here that the Honor's camera turns look a little sharper than those of the competitors. All 3 devices also manage the running test adequately. Of course, it's not perfect, there's some jerkiness and slight shaking, but it's still a 2x zoom, and it's a decent result for that zoom level. Friends, we're now doing a portrait video test. This is with background blur effect on the main lenses. The Honor Magic 8 Pro can shoot 4K at 30 FPS with background blur on its main lens. The Oppo Find X9 Pro can also shoot 4K at 30 frames per second with background blur. And the Vivo X300 Pro can record in 4K at 60 frames per second, which is of course very cool. Vivo and Oppo handle portrait mode quite confidently, maintaining the blur boundary very well, but the Magic 8 Pro's implementation of this mode is really bad. It literally lags even during recording. As a result, we get video with frame drops, lost frames, and noticeable freezes. There are also differences in color reproduction. The video on the left is the brightest, and it seems to lack contrast work, making the image look flatter than that of its competitors. Vivo and Oppo videos are contrasty and saturated, but with a different white balance. Now let's move on to the most challenging test in portrait mode, the tracking shot around a person. With Honor, we see significant problems with dropped frames and focusing issues. This is the weakest result of the three smartphones. Vivo also had a focusing issue at the very beginning of the tracking shot, but it quickly corrected itself and maintained excellent focus throughout. I also don't like that on the X300 Pro, when shooting against the light, the foreground becomes very dark. After all, the foreground in portrait shots is the most important thing. Oppo performs better in this regard. It does well with both focus and the balance of shadows and highlights. However, there's a very noticeable shake, and the video looks very unstable. All the smartphones performed imperfectly, but Honor disappointed me the most, of course. Its portrait video is currently a completely unusable shooting option. Let's move on to the enhanced stabilization test. Notably, Honor and Vivo reduced the resolution to 2.8K in this mode, while Oppo maintains the 4K picture. However, I'll point out that the image quality on the right and center are extremely similar, but the video from the Magic 8 Pro looks quite blurry. Regarding stabilization, the X300 Pro performed best, whether shaken from top to bottom or shaken sideways. It has a very stable result with minimal fluctuations. And that's even though it's positioned on the edge of the tripod. The Honor has the most shake, the Oppo has slightly less, but I'm reminding you again that it has a more advantageous position on a tripod. Enhanced stabilization is also available on telephoto lenses. Here, we see the weakest result again with the Magic 8 Pro, while Oppo and Vivo did relatively well. Let's move on to HDR and logarithmic profile recording with the main camera. Let's start with the extended dynamic range test. And I'm going to say right away that Vivo and Oppo list this shooting mode as Dolby Vision. It's a type of HDR that is supposedly more advanced than standard HDR, and it gives us an even greater dynamic range. Let's see what we get in practice. Let's start with the ultra-wide lens. First, let's see what the video looks like in SDR, in the standard dynamic range. We specifically chose a challenging scene with backlighting to make the difference more noticeable. As always, Honor has the brightest video with a completely blown-out sky. Oppo has the least amount of overexposure, but a dark foreground. Vivo's image is very similar to Oppo, but slightly brighter and with more noticeable flare. When extended dynamic range is activated, there's almost no visible change. With Honor, the image has become slightly darker and more contrasty, while there are absolutely no differences in the center or on the right side. We switch to 1x. We see that Oppo and Vivo have a noticeably wider dynamic range, even in HDR. The sky is also less blown out than on the Honor, and the foreground isn't too dark. When HDR is activated, you can see some changes. On the left, the video became darker and the overexposure slightly decreased. On the right, the colors became more saturated, but there aren't any noticeable changes with the Oppo, except perhaps the image became a bit brighter and the overexposure around the sun slightly increased. Let's activate the telephoto lenses. The Magic 8 Pro consistently delivers the brightest and most overexposed result, but now there's also a loss of focus. With Oppo, the image remains the darkest, looking very expressive, even cinematic, but still too oversaturated, though it's a matter of taste. The X300 Pro delivers a balanced result. Both the foreground are well rendered, and the saturation isn't cranked up too much. And the background isn't as overblown as on the Honor either. When HDR is activated, we see again that the video on the left has become slightly darker and more contrasty than it was. The images in the center and on the right have become more saturated and warmer. Whose result do you like more, friends? Write in the comments. Now let's move on to the logarithmic profile. We used official LUT files from the manufacturers for color grading and didn't change them manually. The exception was Honor. We couldn't find a LUT specifically for the Magic 8 Pro. And all the other LUT files for other Honor models didn't work, leaving the image looking washed out. We even tried applying different LUTs from cameras like DJI and Sony. Nothing worked. Ultimately, we color graded it manually and pulled everything we could from the Honor files. But, as you can see, the result was extremely weak. We couldn't salvage the overexposed areas, and there's a lot of noise in the shadows. Oppo's results were very saturated and warm at all zoom levels, with the darkest foreground. However, since this is a log file, you can easily reduce the saturation and get a more pleasing result. Also, I've noticed that only in videos from the Find X9 Pro was the sky somewhat visible. Vivo's image is less contrasty and less saturated, the sky is completely overexposed, and it's impossible to recover it, no matter how much we reduce the exposure. But overall, the result is normal compared to Honor. Now let's move on to the zoom test. We'll check the smoothness of switching between lenses. Honor's transition from the ultra-wide to the main camera is very noticeable, as the exposure and white balance change significantly. We see a similar situation when switching to the telephoto lens. It's also quite apparent when zooming quickly. With Oppo, when switching from the ultrawide to 1x, we notice a rather sharp stitching with a change in color reproduction. When switching from the main camera to the telephoto lens, there's a definite loss of focus. But this only happened once, and subsequent switches look better. During fast zooming, all the stitching remains quite noticeable and sharp. Let's move on to Vivo. The transition from the ultrawide to the main camera is a little smoother than with the competitors, but color reproduction still changes when switching lenses. When the telephoto lens is activated, you can see quite sharp stitching and a change in exposure and white balance. This stitching is also noticeable during quick zooming, but the transition to the ultrawide lens is smoother. Now let's move on to the video zoom test. But first, let's go over the camera specs. The Honor Magic 8 Pro received 3 main lenses: an ultra-wide 50 megapixel, a primary lens also at 50 megapixels, and a telephoto lens at 200 megapixels. The Oppo Find X9 Pro also has 3 lenses with similar resolution, but with slight differences in sensor sizes and aperture. The Vivo X300 Pro also features 3 modules with similar resolutions and equally small differences in sensor sizes and aperture. Interestingly, the ultra-wide lenses are completely identical for this phone and for Oppo. However, out of these 3 smartphones, only the Find X9 Pro has the ultra-wide lens positioned at the top of the camera module. And that's a very clever solution. When shooting with this lens, your finger won't accidentally get in the frame. Well, we have 3 strong contenders. Let's start comparing them. On the ultra-wide video, we get very similar results. However, the video on the left is noisier than the others, and because of that, the text looks worse. Let's switch to the main lenses, and here, there are absolutely no differences in image detail. Let's move on to the telephoto lenses. Honor has 3.7x, Oppo has 3x, and Vivo has 3.5x. We're getting almost identical frames again. But if you look closely at the details, you can see that the small, fresh blended text above the word milkshake is more readable in the video on the right. The text is slightly worse due to the smaller zoom in the center, and Honor's text looks more blurred. Next up is the 6x zoom. In terms of text readability, all 3 videos look similar. The only difference I can highlight is that the video on the left turned out to be noisier. In the center, the text has noticeable shake, while the result on the right is more stable and without noise. Let's move on to the 10x zoom. Vivo delivers the most precise results here. Its video is the least noisy and the most stable, although Oppo comes very close to it in terms of detail. Honor's result, however, is the most blurry. Now let's engage the maximum zoom, 15x, 18x, and 20x respectively. Despite the strongest digital zoom, the X300 Pro delivers a sharper and more readable result than its competitors. We can easily read even quite small lettering. Oppo shows more distorted letters, and on the left, the video is the noisiest and blurriest. Also, only Vivo offers 8K video recording, and it's available on the main module. But if you compare the 4K images from the competitors, you don't see a significant difference. Why even bother with 8K then? If you're editing 4K or Full HD video and need to crop without losing quality, 8K video will definitely come in handy. Okay friends, what's cool is that all of our smartphones can do dual recording. It's a video where, essentially, we can record simultaneously on 2 cameras. So my front-facing camera is currently recording video on all 3 smartphones. And accordingly, I'm now activating the main lens, and we've started recording with the main lens. It's a 1x lens. There. It's really convenient that Vivo offers recording in 4K 30 frames per second, while the others only offer Full HD 30 FPS. Vivo, of course, looks much better than its competitors. 4K recordings, a neat miniature with rounded corners. Good stabilization makes it a leader among the 3. Both Honor and Oppo have noticeably shaky footage that doesn't look as pleasing as the X300 Pros. The video footage on the Find X9 Pro is particularly shaky, and we really see the difference in Vivo's stabilization versus its competitors when running. Well done Vivo, you get a thumbs up. By the way, this year double video wasn't just received by the Vivo X300 Pro, but also by the brand new iPhone 17 Pro Max, which we've already done several extensive reviews of. The videos turned out to be very detailed and interesting. Links will be in the description, friends. Let's move on to shooting macro video. And all 3 smartphones pleasantly surprised me here. They all use a telephoto lens for this mode. Let me explain why that's cool. In my opinion, the telephoto lens is more convenient for macro photography because you don't need to bring the smartphone right up to the subject, you can shoot from a comfortable distance. As for the results, all 3 allow you to zoom in very well. But the Vivo and Honor have noticeable issues with image stabilization. Oppo also exhibits some wobbling, but it only appears when I'm moving the smartphone quite a bit. Now let's move on to slow-motion video recording. All 3 flagships offer this recording capability in 4K at 120 FPS. I think all the videos turned out to be interesting and high quality. They differ in color rendition and background blur. There's optical blur in the center and on the right, while the entire frame is in focus on the left. Also, all three smartphones can record slow-motion video using the telephoto lenses, and these are the results we get with that kind of recording. Switching over to 240 frames per second, all the smartphones record slow motion in full HD. Despite the same resolution, there's a noticeable difference in image quality. The Vivo has better detail rendering on the right. For example, this is apparent when we look at the stand. However, the image stabilization works inconsistently on all three smartphones. I wouldn't recommend shooting slow motion at 240 frames per second when in motion. In static shooting, all three smartphones deliver excellent results. By the way, if you're wondering what's going on here, we're at a sale of electronics in a Dubai store called NUN. We can also switch to telephoto lenses at 240 FPS. Here are the results. Let's see how the smartphones shoot one of my favorite modes, time-lapse. The Honor gives us the brightest result. It looks pleasing. The Find X9 Pro has a slightly darker and more contrasted image, and throughout the video, there are noticeable exposure fluctuations. The Vivo video is the darkest, and noise is visible in the shadows, something neither Oppo nor Honor have. We've finished the video test and are moving on to photos, starting with selfies. The first photo is taken in challenging conditions, against the sunlight. The Honor photo on the left had the least amount of overexposure in the foreground. However, I'm noting that the sun itself doesn't fall into the frame as strongly as it does in the Oppo and Vivo shots. By the way, we only see a strong glare from top to bottom on the X300 Pro. There are differences in color reproduction as well. The photo on the left is relatively pale and yellowish. The shots in the center and on the right are more saturated, but with different skin tones. Oppo made the skin tone a bit rosy, while Vivo made it tanned. In the second photo, the difference in color reproduction isn't as strong anymore, but the photo still differs in saturation. Here, you can see that Honor has optical background blur, Vivo's is significantly weaker, and Oppo has the entire shot in focus. Let's move on to portrait selfies. Let's start with this photo of my daughters. All three smartphones produced a rather uncertain hair processing job. In the photo with the Honor, we see that there's an unblurred part of the building right above my daughter Masha's head. A similar error exists with the Vivo as well. Oppo, I'd say, handled it the best of the bunch. The second photo is of me alone. This time, the Magic 8 Pro performed the best. At the same time, we see a blatant blurring error in the hair with Oppo, and Vivo has a generally disappointing result. The heart and some fragments of letters remained in focus. Now we're taking photos of people with the main camera block. Vivo has a Zeiss color profile. The ultra-wide photos from Honor turn out to be the most contrasting and saturated, whereas Vivo and Oppo shots look softer and are quite similar to each other. The situation with photos from the main camera is similar. The Magic 8 Pro is again boosting contrast, and its green also turns out to be more saturated. Oppo and Vivo's photos are once again very similar, but with slightly different skin tones. Next, zoom. Here, all three shots look similar, but the Oppo saturates the skin a bit more and makes it reddish, unlike its competitors. Moving on to the telephoto lenses, the Honor delivers a shot with a soft sandy hue, but with a very strong contrast and deep shadows. Oppo's photos are slightly warmer, with lower contrast, and skin tones have a pinkish hue. The photo on the right, however, came out a bit yellow. Let's move on. At 10x zoom, you can clearly see how the smartphones process the photos. Vivo really went overboard here. Skin looks overly blurred and unnatural, and many details are simply wiped out. The photo from the Magic 8 Pro turned out too sharp, but there's still not as much artificial enhancement as there is on the X300 Pro. The most natural result comes from Oppo. There's no excessive sharpness here, and no aggressive skin smoothing. Interestingly, at 20x zoom, Vivo no longer shows that kind of processing, and the photo looks more realistic. Overall, all three smartphones performed well at that zoom level. The only difference is the color rendition, and again, Honor has slightly more boosted sharpness. Let's move on to portrait shooting with background digital blur. For Oppo and Vivo, we're setting the blur to f2.8 and also selecting the Zeiss color profile on the X300 Pro. At 1x zoom, we get very similar photos with a slight difference in white balance and exposure. All three smartphones handled the blur effect neatly. Now let's switch to 35mm on Vivo and 2x zoom on the others. And here we see three almost identical results. Let's enable the telephoto lenses. At this zoom level, Oppo handled it the neatest and did an excellent job of separating even fine hair from the background. With Honor and Vivo, for example, in the left side of the photo we see blurred hair, and with the X300 Pro, the rope behind the ear has been wiped out too. We're engaging the 3.6x zoom on the Oppo, while the Honor and Vivo still have 2 more zoom levels available. All 3 performed very similarly and slightly blurred the finest hairs. At the highest available zoom on the Honor and Vivo, we get slightly different results in terms of blur. The hair detail on the left on the Magic 8 Pro looks uncertain, and the blur didn't work correctly. The blur on this area looks more refined with Vivo, but the hair is partially erased. As for the image quality, it's excellent across all zoom levels for all 3, so I didn't elaborate on that point. Second photo shoot. Now I'm in the frame. The settings are the same. In 1x mode, under artificial lighting, the differences mostly come down to white balance. On the left, we see a greenish shot with a yellowish skin tone. In the center, the result is the warmest, with slightly orange skin. On the right, a similar result, but a bit cooler and with a pinkish skin tone. And in terms of blur, everything looks extremely similar. The smartphones handled it well. Next level zoom. Overall, the color reproduction doesn't change here, and in terms of blur, all 3 perform identically again. When switching to telephoto lenses, the white balance shifted slightly on all 3 smartphones. The blur is excellent, and the photo quality is superb too. At the highest zoom levels, nothing particularly changes again on the Magic 8 Pro and X300 Pro. Portraits look good, well developed and without excessive retouching. Let's move on to our signature fork and spoon test. In it we check how smartphone blur algorithms perform with thin objects in the frame. In the photos taken with the main lens, all 3 did a great job. The spoon is in focus, however Honor and Vivo slightly blurred the tip. But that's already nitpicking. On the next zoom, all the smartphones still kept the spoon in the frame. Moving on. There were no difficulties with the spoon on the telephoto lenses either. But interestingly, you can see that Oppo has some blurring artifacts near my eyebrow. Let's move on. The trio performed excellently again. The spoon is in place and in focus. We get a similar result at the highest zoom levels on the Honor and Vivo. Overall, all 3 did a great job, despite minor shortcomings. Now let's photograph everything around us. Photos from the ultra-wide lens turn out excellent and extremely similar across all 3 devices, shot by shot, depending on the conditions. The exposure, contrast, white balance, and saturation of the photos change slightly. Now switching to the main lens. When shooting into the light, we see that Oppo and Vivo performed quite well in those conditions. While Honor can't even show the silhouette of the sun, and the sky is overexposed more than its competitors. We get a similar result in the next photo as well. Incidentally, Oppo maintains a bright foreground, while the sky remains well exposed, which tells us about the very wide dynamic range of the main camera on this smartphone. At the same time, competitors reduce the exposure to prevent the sky from being overexposed, resulting in darker images. The photo styles from the lenses turn out to be great on all 3 smartphones, but color reproduction varies considerably depending on the shooting conditions. Let's see how the smartphones handle raw photos. These are shots that are saved directly from the camera sensor, without any processing by the smartphone. We got some really beautiful sunset shots. In post-processing, we removed the blown-out highlights and lightened the shadows a bit. Overall, I can say that all the photos turned out great. There's no noise, no blown-out highlights, and the photos are easy to edit, and that's the most important thing for a RAW format. Let's move on to the photo zoom test. Photos taken with the ultra-wide lens look very similar across all 3 smartphones, but we can see in the details that Oppo and Honor have sharper images than Vivo, although there are no differences in terms of detail. Turning on the main cameras, and here there are absolutely no differences in the results in terms of detail clarity. They all performed roughly the same. Let's move on to the telephoto lenses. The shots are similar again, but the Honor and Vivo actually have better sharpness and text readability due to their larger size. 10x zoom, not much to say here. All 3 smartphones performed almost identically. Zooming in further, and here we get some interesting results. Smartphones are heavily embellishing the letters, but it's not working for everyone. Oppo performed the worst. The text is completely unreadable. Honor did slightly better. Vivo produced the neatest text. The last zoom is 100x for Honor and Vivo, and 120x for Oppo. Again, the worst result is visible in the center. On the left, with the Magic 8 Pro, some lettering can be made out. The letters are quite distorted, however. Both large and small text look very neat on the Vivo, although it did process some of the text incorrectly. Nevertheless, this is still the best result, and if it's important for you to zoom in on small text from a distance and read it, the X300 Pro will handle this task better than its competitors. Let's move on to the delicious photos. Food photography. All 3 smartphones take very interesting and beautiful shots, which differ only slightly in color reproduction, but the quality is excellent in all of them, and the photos turn out to be very appetizing. Now, let's move on to macro photography. Oppo and Vivo have implemented macro photography using a telephoto lens, but other zoom levels are also available. The situation with Honor is strange. In super macro mode, we only have access to the ultra-wide and the main lens with a 2x zoom. However, we can turn off super macro mode and take really good macro photos, including with the telephoto lens. And even with a decent digital zoom. Interestingly, Oppo has a neat feature. You can enable blur in macro mode, or you can activate full sharpness to ensure the maximum area of the shot is in focus. As for the photos themselves, all three perform excellently overall and handle even large digital zooms very well. What result do you like the most? Write in the comments, friends. Now let's test the serial photos, the mode that takes a bunch of shots in a few seconds. We'll choose a few random frames and compare them. No one had any issues with focusing, but there are other differences between the shots. The Honor produces the least overexposed result, but you can see a lot of noise in the foreground. In both shots, the image is the brightest, and the sky is the most overexposed. The Vivo has slightly less overexposure, but there are no noises in either of the first two. We see similar results in all the following photos. Let's test the instant photo mode. Honor calls this mode motion capture. Oppo has a sports mode. Vivo simply calls it instant shot. The smartphones handled focusing perfectly, both in my daughter's hands and on the sand. However, we again see some differences in how the smartphones deal with backlighting. With Honor and Oppo, the sky and the sun's silhouette look normal, while on the X300 Pro photos, we see significant overexposure. Friends, night has fallen, and now we're going to test the photo and video capabilities in low light and artificial lighting conditions. Let's go. Okay friends, as tradition dictates, our first test is the 4K front-facing camera at 30 frames per second on all three smartphones. I'm in a very beautiful location, it's called Dubai Old City. And we're gonna do these tests here now. Let's go. I want to start by talking about how the smartphones handle light sources, using lamps as an example. Let's pick any still frame from the beginning of the test and take a look. You can see that the lamps, processed in the video on the right, look best, while those in the center and on the left are all overexposed. On the other hand, Oppo and Honor have slightly higher overall exposure and better illumination of the foreground. I wouldn't say the foreground in the Vivo shots is dark though. My face is quite legible, and the image is still contrasty with good dynamic range. However, I noticed a significant motion blur of the background with Oppo while walking. It's also there on the sides of the smartphones, but it's not as pronounced. When shooting in bright light, we can see a clearer difference in color reproduction. The image on the left and center is warmer, but Honor makes skin tones look tan, while Oppo makes them reddish. The video on the right is colder, and the skin tone is yellowish. By the way friends, it turned out that the auto backlight was disabled on my Honor. Now it's lit. It automatically illuminates the face. Well, there are quite a few lights here, but that's how the background looks on my end. There are a lot of lights here, but I really like how the Honor illuminates the face. But I think even in low light conditions, well, you can definitely use shooting like this. It's nice that the illumination activates on all three smartphones, and it also automatically turns off when there's enough light. By the way, you can see that the smartphones reacted differently in yellow lighting. While the Honor and Vivo devices significantly yellowed the image, Oppo tried to even out the skin tone and make it reddish. All the smartphones handled the running test less than perfectly, but I do note that Vivo exhibited the least amount of smearing and shakiness. The image jitters and smears more noticeably with Oppo and Honor. But we remember that the Find X9 Pro is in a favorable position on the tripod, and even so, it's outperformed by the X300 Pro. When switching the video to 60 FPS, we see that there's more noise in all three videos, but it's especially noticeable in the video on the left. Regarding color reproduction, the situation hasn't changed much when shooting in good light, but all three videos have become more saturated, and the difference in skin tone is now even more noticeable. There are also changes in stabilization. All the smartphones now have significantly less blur, and the harsh jerks have disappeared. However, the videos still wobble quite a bit, including those from Vivo. Okay, now I've enabled video portrait mode with background blur effect. The Honor Magic 8 Pro doesn't have a video portrait mode. In portrait mode, both the Oppo and Vivo generally produce a decent result with a reasonably neat blur boundary. There's no lack of focus, even when I turn away, and there are no noticeable harsh errors in the blur. When shooting against bright light, all three smartphones produce noticeable flares, but there are no issues with blurring or focusing in the center and to the right. In terms of stabilization in this mode, the X300 Pro performs noticeably better. It holds the image steadily, whereas the Oppo exhibits significant shaking. Friends, now we have a test of the ultra-wide-angle lens. 4K, 30 FPS. Filming everything around. We're shooting, we're watching, to see how our smartphones perform when we're filming a beautiful shot like that. We immediately notice that the image on the Vivo and Oppo devices wobbles significantly, even when simply walking. All three smartphones exhibit smearing. This is particularly noticeable with the light sources across the water. The Honor's image overexposes distant lighting at some point, while this doesn't happen with the competitors. In the stabilization test, the Vivo X300 Pro performed the best. It has the most stable result. Honor did a bit worse, but Oppo had the weakest stabilization. When switching to 60 FPS, we see that the Magic 8 Pro's situation with the lights hasn't changed. The lights only appear when I get closer to them. Vivo and Oppo handle light sources better, and their color reproduction is different too. The image is oversaturated, yellow on the left, less saturated but still yellow in the center, and softer, with a sandy tone on the right. Of course, we have yellow lighting in the shot, so it's unfair to criticize the smartphones for the yellow color, but Honor definitely went overboard with the saturation. But did the video become more stable at 60 FPS? Not really. Honor still has a wobble, Oppo's video is very shaky, and Vivo also exhibits frame shake. And here's how the video looks when recording yourself on the ultra-wide lens in 4K. 30 FPS, recording yourself. Now I'm gonna move into a better lit area, because otherwise the ultra-wide lenses might struggle. When filming selfies, we see that the skin tone changes depending on the lighting across all three smartphones. But there's a nuance. Oppo tries to maintain a more or less natural rosy skin tone regardless of the lighting, unlike Honor and Vivo, which tend to shift it towards yellow. There are no other noticeable differences in the video. When running, all three smartphones performed roughly the same. All of them have a bit of background wobble and blur, but the overall result is normal for these conditions. Switching to 60 FPS makes the image less yellow on all three smartphones, although the video still yellows compared to the others. In terms of stabilization, I can note an improvement. All three videos have become smoother, and background blur is no longer visible. Let's switch to the main lens and record everything around. With Oppo, there's a noticeable drop in frames when the camera is rotated. It's in the original video file, it's not a bug in the editing or rendering. Both Honor and Vivo have smooth images at the same time. There's a difference in color reproduction as well. On the left, the result has an orange tint, in the center it's yellow, and on the right it's greenish. But in terms of image quality and working with light sources, there's no difference visible. Okay, on the Oppo Find X9 Pro, I'm now activating enhanced stabilization. That means, well, I hope the image will hold a little steadier. Even with enhanced stabilization, Oppo didn't perform very confidently during the running test. It exhibits the strongest smearing of light sources. The side smartphones performed quite confidently, considering their less advantageous position on the tripod. Honor experiences a significant drop in frames at 60 FPS. At the same time, Oppo's tracking shot now looks smooth. With Vivo, the picture was smooth at 30 FPS. As for stabilization, the increased frame rate didn't improve it at all. In fact, it made the shakiness worse on all three smartphones. Okay friends, I've now switched to 4K 30 FPS using the main lens. When filming selfies, the dropped frames on the Honor become noticeable again. It's especially apparent during camera rotations, like this. The problems are in the original footage. And here's what it looks like, not in editing, but in a regular video player. We see the same issues here. Oppo and Vivo don't have these problems. I'm also noting that their color reproduction is more pleasing, whereas the picture on the left is yellow again. However, something strange happened with the white balance on the X300 Pro during the running test. Now it's made the video bright yellow, while the Honor's colors have become more realistic. As for stabilization, all three performed quite confidently. When switching to 60 FPS, we see very noticeable flickering and digital noise on the Magic 8 Pro. This is just a defective image. Compared to this result, the image quality from Vivo and Oppo is simply excellent. There's no noticeable change in stabilization. It was quite confident at 30 FPS and works well here too. Okay friends, now let's try recording with the background blur effect. This is video portrait mode. This is very interesting. Let's see what those little lights behind me look like. But I think it should look really cool and beautiful. In portrait mode, the Magic 8 Pro continues to experience severe frame loss. The video looks choppy and unpleasant, so he's immediately out of the comparison. Vivo and Oppo produced pleasing images. The blur boundaries look neat. There's no loss of focus. Excellent results. They also handled the running test very well. It's impossible to assess Honor stabilization. The video looks too shaky. We're doing a tracking shot around the person. Oppo and Vivo did a great job. Smooth, beautiful, neat. Honor is a disaster. Okay friends, now we have our favorite dual recording mode, where I see myself, I record myself with the front camera and immediately record everything around with the main lens. This is a really great mode that allows you to showcase the beauty of the place you're in. In dual recording mode, you can clearly see that even while walking, the Oppo has an unpleasant wobble with its main camera. The Honor and Vivo are much more stable. As for image quality, a very telling moment is right here, where the lighting has decreased. With the Vivo, despite the 4K, all the texture of the road is smoothed out. The Oppo looks a bit better. but the highest quality result is on the left, from the Magic 8 Pro. However, the front-facing camera selfie looks best on the X300 Pro, where even with minimal lighting, my face remains well lit and readable. Now let's move on to the video zoom test in such challenging conditions. The ultra-wide video looks very similar on the Vivo and Oppo. They were more or less able to reveal the overexposed signs, and their results are similar in terms of detail as well. Honor performs better in low light. The text is invisible. It also didn't do as well with detail compared to the competitors. Take a look, for example, at the grid above the sign. We'll use the main lenses. Here, all three smartphones produced a similar result in terms of detail and handled light sources adequately. The X300 Pro performed slightly better than the others. It captured the signage and displays underneath, with the least amount of blown-out highlights. Switching to the telephoto lenses, we see three very similar images with a slight difference in color reproduction. 10x digital zoom. There are some differences in the details here. The Magic 8 Pro captured the black color most accurately, and all the colors overall, but it has the noisiest result. Oppo has less noise, but the letters are heavily distorted and seem to have a life of their own. The Vivo video has the least noise, and the letters look a little more defined than those of the competitors. However, the image is very unstable, just like with Honor. Now, let's enable the maximum available zoom levels. On the video on the left, you can see noise and color distortion. The situation is similar in the center. There's a lot of digital noise, with added exposure jumps and distortions of the outlines of letters and other details. The result on the right is the cleanest and most accurate. Switching from 30 to 60 FPS doesn't show any significant changes. The results are pretty much the same. Remember that Vivo has 8K. Let's enable it. The video quality just got worse. In bright light, there was noticeably less noise and details were captured better. Let's wrap up the night video test with this beautiful time-lapse from the Dubai Metro. All three results are excellent, but it's clear that the Honor has smoother video because it captured more frames during recording than Oppo and Vivo. Let's move on to the night photo tests, and we're starting, as always, with selfies. The first photo nicely demonstrates the dynamic range of each front-facing camera. Vivo showed the sign the best, preserving the logo's color quite accurately. At the same time, the foreground looks sufficiently illuminated and readable. The Honor performs better in bright light, but the overall exposure is higher. The Oppo produced the most overexposed text. However, the foreground is only slightly brighter than it is on the Vivo. Second selfie. Here, there's less light, and all three smartphones activate face illumination. In terms of quality, the photos look extremely similar, and all the differences here come down to slightly different color rendition and shadows. Now we're taking portrait selfies. In the first series of photos, all three smartphones performed quite poorly with my wife's hair. You can see many errors, and the blur boundary looks very messy. The second set of photos. This is where Vivo had the weakest result. For some reason, it decided to keep the entire Burj Khalifa in focus, but blurred the palm tree that's closer to us. Now we're taking photos of people using the main camera block. On the Vivo, the color profile is vivid. All three photos taken with the ultra-wide lens look good, and the only difference I can note is the different white balance and exposure. The photos on the left and right are a bit darker than the one in the center, and the skin tones turned out slightly different across all three smartphones. Let's use the main lens. With Oppo, we see a very strong shift in color reproduction. The photo became yellow, whereas Honor and Vivo have more stable and, incidentally, quite similar results in terms of color. Let's move on to the telephoto lenses. Here, all three smartphones perform in a fairly similar way. The differences in white balance, brightness, and skin tone are minimal. At 10x zoom, we see active photo editing across all three smartphones. Skin appears very smooth, some details are blurred, but what looks particularly bad is the way the eyes are drawn in. All the smartphones heavily embellish the capillaries in the eyes. It's not as noticeable with Vivo, whereas with Oppo and Honor, the whites of the eyes look very strange, almost dirty. The capillaries on the left appeared almost black. All the smartphones render photos with a similar situation at 20x zoom, but Oppo's is the most heavily processed. It has the most distortions in the eye area and the most blurred skin details, for example on the cheeks. We're doing a second photo session to compare the results. On the ultra-wide lens, I can once again note only differences in color reproduction and exposure. The photo on the left is the darkest, with a yellowish tint and an almost black night sky. The photo in the center is the brightest and warmest, and the sky is bluish. Vivo's shots are a bit darker than Oppo's and have a greenish tint. Interestingly, the sky on the right side turned out to be the most vibrant. Switching to 1x, we immediately get the warmest image of all on the left. The centered photo yellows, and we see a relatively cool photo on the right. Now let's switch to the telephoto lenses. The color reproduction barely changes here. Upon closer examination, it's clear that Oppo heavily sharpens photos, which makes my face look a bit rough, while the results are softer on the sides. At 10x zoom, we again see aggressive photo processing, and this time, it's even stronger than in the first photo session. The results are very unnatural and blurry, as if the photo was literally drawn. When zooming to 20x, the detail returned on the Vivo photos. It feels like the crop up to 10x is done with the main camera, while 20x is already using the telephoto lens because the difference between the shots is huge. And at 20x, the added details are definitely less aggressive. Honor performed quite well, just like the 10x. At the same time, Oppo's photos are still the same blurry mess. Now let's move on to portrait mode. The settings are the same for all smartphones, as they were during daytime shooting. All photos taken with the main lens look great. The blur effect works smoothly, and there are no visible issues or glaring mistakes. Let's move on. We're getting good shots again, with quality background blur. All three smartphones handled even fine hair quite well. Next, zoom. Upon closer inspection, it's noticeable that all the smartphones have slightly blurred the hair, especially in the left part of the photo. With Oppo, for example, the incorrect blurring has resulted in the hair appearing torn. They seem to be floating in the air. Honor completely erased the fine hair on the left, although we can see them on the shoulder below. Vivo retained the hair better, but its blurring isn't as strong as the competitors. Let's enable the latest zoom levels on the Honor and Vivo. The Magic 8 Pro performed excellently, preserving even the finest, individual hairs on the sides and above the head. With the Vivo, for example, the hairs above the head are blurred, and similar blurring errors are noticeable on the sides. Now for an easier task. I don't have that long hair, so the smartphone should perform without problems. That's how it is. The images at all zoom levels are great, without any noticeable blurring errors. They are also quite similar in color reproduction, almost at all zoom levels. The exception is at the maximum zoom levels. Here I want to highlight the photos from the X300 Pro. The image processing is very noticeable here, and as a result, facial details are lost, like the wrinkles on the forehead. Also, at this level of zoom, Vivo inexplicably boosted the saturation and made the skin a bright orange. Now we're taking landscape shots and starting with the ultra-wide lens. On the first photo, a difference in how the cameras handle artificial lighting is noticeable. On the upper left and right sides of the photo, we see a prominent blue glare, whereas there's no such glare in the center. The Magic 8 Pro exhibits slightly less noticeable light flares from streetlights compared to its competitors. In the next series of shots, we see that Honor and Vivo handled the light sources similarly. They have minimal lens flare, the Oppo shot is a bit brighter on its own. And because of that, light sources also turned out to be slightly brighter and overexposed. Let's switch to the main lenses. On the first photo, there aren't any noticeable differences between the shots, and all the smartphones give us very high quality and beautiful photos. For the second set of photos, I want to draw your attention to the sign on the lower right. The Honor one is the most well-defined, the Vivo one is slightly overexposed, and the most significant overexposure is visible in the center. And another landscape shot. Here again, the differences between the results are almost non-existent, apart from a slightly different white balance. That's it. I also took some night photos with the telephoto lenses. Let's start with this beautiful shot of the Ferris wheel. The results from Honor and Vivo look neat and beautiful, while Oppo shows a noticeable flare. And there's a rough gradient visible in the sky, what's called color banding. Next photo. The results on the left and right are very similar, a perfectly decent result, but in the center we see a weaker shot again. With Oppo, the shadows are too dark, and half the buildings are simply invisible. Let's move on to night zoom. On the ultra-wide lens, the results were quite similar in terms of detail clarity. The light sources look a little different. The minimum flare was on the left, the sign on the right looks brighter, and the center is the brightest. Let's switch to the main lenses, and here we see three almost identical results. Even with light sources, the smartphones performed very similarly. Let's enable the telephoto lenses. Again, in terms of readability, we get similar shots, but I can still note some differences. The Honor sign looks the least overexposed, the Oppo shows a rather bright halo around the letters, and the Vivo has a soft glow. Let's move on to the next zooms. Let's take a closer look at the fine print. Overall, the results are readable on all three smartphones, but the Vivo letters look the neatest and clearest. Let's zoom in further. Again, all three results turned out to be well developed, but with slight differences. The letters look even and neat on the Honor, while on the Oppo they are dark and quite noisy. With Vivo, you can see pixelation creeping in along the text edges. This is the second to last zoom level. All three shots look very similar, and the text is readable in all of them. At the last zoom level, the situation is comparable, and here I can only note that the Oppo result is slightly overexposed, which causes blown out edges on the letters and other details. Our competitors don't have this problem, and the details appear more distinct. Overall, all three smartphones perform confidently even in these conditions, and deliver a powerful zoom, allowing us to read even very distant text. Let's move on to shooting raw photos in low light. I won't be analyzing each photo from every lens here, as the general trend is quite obvious. Honor delivers the weakest results, with a lot of noise and strong overexposure in bright areas that aren't always easy to fix. This applies to photos taken with all the lenses. Oppo, the photos are better, there's no such noise here, and it's more flexible to edit photos. But Vivo gives us the most interesting shots. Its raw photos have the largest dynamic range. We can easily recover blown-out areas. For example, signs. Working with the shadows on the X300 Pro is also very easy. And if we need to brighten dark areas, we can do that, and not worry about a lot of noise appearing. Let me remind you that these shots on the Vivo were taken in S-RAW, and I always advise using it for nighttime RAW photography. Now let's move on to long exposure photography. In this mode, smartphones take a single photo over several seconds, and sometimes even minutes. Honor calls this mode light painting, while Oppo and Vivo call it long exposure. It's great that all three smartphones offer us several preset options for shooting with shutter speed, which are suitable for different scenarios. Here are the results I got when shooting from a train in the Dubai metro. And let's talk about the camera features. I want to mention right away that many features on all three smartphones are only available when connected to the internet, which of course isn't very convenient. What interesting things does Honor offer? First of all, its lens. It's similar to a Google lens. It works exactly the same way. You can scan a QR code or highlight and translate any text. You can copy it to the clipboard. This assistant works flawlessly with English. When shooting regular video, we have access to color filters, and when switching to profile mode and activating the log, you can immediately enable a LUT to record already color-graded video. There's a C mode for shooting photos and videos at concerts. And that's probably all. Let's move on to Oppo. Some interesting features include so-called intelligent scenarios, which adjust the camera settings according to the conditions in which you're recording. There are three options: scene, silhouette, and fireworks. There's also a set of filters and retouching tools. The Pro mode, which is called Master here, also has filter sets, but with more refined settings. There's a Hasselblad mode where we only have optical zoom available, and the phone captures images at the maximum available resolution. We can also shoot live photos here. There's also a Pro video recording mode where you can activate the histogram and monitor the audio level. Video in this mode is shot in log and can be restored in SDR or HDR. However, there are no LUT presets like those found on Honor phones. There's an interesting underwater mode that disables touch controls and allows you to use only buttons to take photos and videos with a shallow dive. However, the smartphone has an IP69 body protection. It's not designed for submersion, and it's best not to use it for that purpose without a protective case. What else? A photo mode for identification with AI. It's a neat feature. You can prepare a photo for documents without going to a photo studio. There's also a sticker mode where, as the name suggests, you can add different stickers to your photos. There's a dedicated scanning mode for text, and it's literally called that. The Brino scanning mode also lets you work with documents and QR codes. Another interesting feature is the imitation of the Hasselblad camera interface. Let's move on to Vivo. It offers quite a few neat tricks. Of course, there are filters here, which they call styles. There's also a storyboard mode. Basically, it's just a collage of 2 or 3 photos, which, what's more, doesn't work without an internet connection. There's an option to remove people, but again, it only works with an internet connection. And the strangest thing is, during the test my phone was connected to Wi-Fi, but the function still didn't work for me. Friends, if you know what the problem is, be sure to write in the comments. For portrait photography, there's a face correction option where you can choose and adjust 3 presets. Below that, you can activate styles, and there are a lot of them. We've already shown how this works in other videos. The principle here is similar, but again, it requires a network connection. There's an eco mode for recording longer videos, which will help prevent the smartphone from overheating. When shooting portraits, there's a bokeh setting and a beauty mode where you can fine-tune skin processing and even alter facial features. We also see quite a few shooting styles here. In Pro mode, everything is generally similar to what competitors offer, but there are unique features. For example, maximum focus or autofocus with exposure priority. Like with the others, Vivo allows you to enable log and color recovery in Pro mode, but you can't select a LUT here. There are additional modes like document and text scanning, and code scanning, and it works roughly the same way as it does on Oppo and Honor. In landscape and night modes, AI visual can activate. This function automatically processes photos identifying the scene, but again, requires a network connection. I also want to talk about one of the most interesting and cool features of Oppo and Vivo. Of course, it's the external telephoto lenses, an extremely interesting addition to the smartphone camera. I've already tested such a lens for the Vivo X200 Ultra, and even made a comparison against professional Sony and Nikon cameras. The results were unexpected, so if you're interested, there's a link in the description, friends. It's great that we can now install the same telephoto lenses even in the Pro versions of Oppo and Vivo. I really want to order these lenses and test them. Subscribe so you don't miss this video. Honor, however, doesn't have this feature. Maybe they'll add it in the Ultra version. We'll see. We've finished with the photo and video tests. Now let's see what battery life we have left. Well friends, our shooting day is over. The Honor Magic 8 Pro has 33% battery remaining, but we started with 86%. The Oppo has 56%, and the Vivo has 49%. So, it gets a thumbs up. On the second day of filming, all three smartphones were charged to 100%, and after the tests, the Honor had 36% left, the Oppo had 67%, and the Vivo had 57%. Regarding specs, the Oppo Find X9 Pro has the largest battery, a whopping 7,500 mAh. The Honor has a slightly smaller battery at 7,200 mAh, and the Vivo has the smallest battery at 6,510 mAh. There are also differences in the battery technologies. The Oppo has the most modern and durable battery thanks to its silicon carbon anode. The Honor has a polymer battery, which is thinner and more structurally stable. Vivo has a lithium-ion battery with silicon carbon anode. Let's talk about the screens now. The Honor features an LTPO OLED display with a 6.71-inch diagonal and a peak brightness of up to 6,000 nits. The Oppo uses an AMOLED panel with a 6.78-inch diagonal and brightness up to 1,800 nits. The X300 Pro also has an AMOLED screen, this one's 6.78 inches, but brighter, with a claimed peak brightness of up to 4,500 nits. There are also differences in resolution. The Magic 8 Pro has Full HD+. The Oppo has 2772 by 1272 pixels, and the Vivo has 2800 by 1260 pixels. All three support a refresh rate of up to 120 Hz. We're setting the brightness to maximum and measuring flicker. The Honor displayed 7%, Oppo 14%, and Vivo didn't exceed 4%. At half brightness, the Magic 8 Pro showed around 9% PWM, Oppo registered over 16%, and the Vivo X300 Pro only about 5%. Minimum brightness. Honor shows approximately 8% PWM, Oppo approximately 9 to 10%, and finally, Vivo around 3%. Let's move on to performance testing. Vivo and Oppo run on the MediaTek Dimensity 9500 chip, while Oppo features the newest Snapdragon 8 Ultra mobile platform, made on the basis of the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, specifically for Honor. The Magic 8 Pro has the Adreno 840 for video processing, while Vivo and Oppo share the same Mali G1 Ultra. Let's move on to the tests, starting with Antutu. The Honor Magic 8 Pro finished the test first and scored the highest. Next was the Oppo Find X9 Pro, which trailed Honor in the results. Finally, Vivo completed the test, scoring almost the same number of points as Oppo. Now we'll take measurements in Geekbench. The Honor finished the processor test first again, Vivo finished second, and Oppo finished last. The Magic 8 Pro also outperformed its rivals in terms of score, but the margin was minimal. Interestingly, Honor finished last in the video chip test, yet still scored higher than everyone else. Oppo produced a slightly lower score, while Vivo was the weakest of the bunch. The final 3D Mark test, where we checked smartphones for stability under prolonged loads. The Honor proved to be the most stable, scoring 67.4%. Vivo came in second with a score of 54.2%, and Oppo took third place with 44.8%. During the test, the Magic 8 Pro got the hottest, reaching 51 degrees Celsius. Oppo's temperature remained below 41 degrees, while Vivo heated up to 44 degrees. Now we're testing Wi-Fi speeds. Honor achieved 106 megabit per second for download and 10.5 megabit per second for upload. Oppo got 104 and 10.6 megabit per second respectively, and Vivo produced an absolutely identical result. Let's immediately test the mobile network speed. The Honor Magic 8 Pro achieved the maximum download speed of 1155 megabit per second, and the best upload speed was 147 megabit per second. Oppo scored 1142 megabit per second and 148 megabit per second respectively. Vivo's maximum download and upload speeds were lower, at 595 and 125 megabit per second. Well friends, let's sum up the results, and as always we'll start with the prices of these smartphones. The Honor Magic 8 Pro with 256GB can now be purchased for $900. The new Oppo Find X9 Pro will cost the same. Meanwhile, the Vivo X300 Pro can be found for around $825. And I bought the Honor for $975, the Oppo for $960, and the Vivo for $910. Should you consider the Honor and Oppo, or is it better to take a closer look at the Vivo? Let's start with the Honor Magic 8 Pro. One of the main advantages of this smartphone is its performance. It showed itself to be the most powerful and stable of this trio in tests. Most likely, this Honor will be better suited for games and other demanding tasks. The Magic 8 Pro performed confidently in photo shooting. Portrait shots, landscape photos, macro, food photography, all are on point. The photo zoom is powerful, and raw images look good in daylight. The spoon and fork test was passed without any issues, which speaks to the careful work of the blurring algorithms. However, I can't say that it performed significantly better than the competition. No, it just performed well in these tests, and I can't call the Magic 8 Pro a photography leader. So let's do this. If smartphones performed equally confidently in some tests, I won't mention it every time so as not to drag out the video. I'll just highlight the strongest and weakest aspects of each flagship. Agreed? Okay. Regarding video recording, Honor has quite good stabilization on the front-facing camera in normal daytime shooting, and also when recording with the main camera array. But this smartphone turned out to have more drawbacks. The color reproduction is very questionable, often too bright, oversaturated, and sometimes excessively yellow in certain lighting conditions. One of the main problems when shooting video is frame drops when recording on the main camera, which is especially noticeable in portrait mode and in low light. The smartphone sometimes lags even while recording video, simply outputting flawed frames. HDR and LOG on the Magic 8 Pro are the worst of the three. Both the front-facing camera and the main camera produce useless results when shooting in HDR. It doesn't improve video at all when shooting in challenging conditions. Video shot in log profile is impossible to color grade properly to look on par with Vivo and Oppo results. What else? There's no portrait video on the front camera at all, and the shooting angles are limited to wide and standard, without the 2x zoom that competitors offer. The video zoom is the weakest of the three, with a maximum of only 15x, compared to 18x and 20x on the competitors, and the video quality when zooming is poor. The frames are noisy, and the details are less discernible. The strong stabilization doesn't work well. In fact, it doesn't work at all, as it doesn't compensate for camera shake. Night photography is also disappointing. Video from both the front-facing camera and the main camera block comes out with an oversaturated yellow image. There's flickering and noise when shooting at 60 fps at 1x. As for photos, landscape shots in difficult lighting conditions look worse than those of competitors. The smartphone struggles with backlighting. The night raw photos are very weak, with a lot of noise in the shadows, and overexposed areas are often simply impossible to recover. Also, a definite drawback is that the battery life is the worst of the bunch, despite the impressive battery capacity. And to top it off, the Honor charges slower than its competitors. Let's move on to the Oppo Find X9 Pro. This smartphone for me is associated with the word stability. What do I mean? Oppo pleases with color reproduction stability. In almost all tests, it delivers a bright, warm image with predictable white balance, and with a rosy skin tone. That's one of Oppo's main strengths. You almost always know what to expect from it, whereas with Vivo and Honor, the color results often change depending on the shooting conditions. And the Find X9 Pro even tried to even out the color and make skin rosy in a difficult nighttime shot with yellow lighting. You can rely on it in this regard. I'm also noting the appearance of 4K 30 fps portrait video on the front camera. The Find X8 Ultra didn't even have that mode. And here, in the new Pro version, it finally appeared. This has the largest battery of the three, and over both shooting days, the Find X9 Pro really did conserve the most battery life. The stated capacity is genuinely felt in practice. I also like the design solution for the camera block. Oppo ditched the camera bump and created a neat module that looks very attractive in person. And the placement of the ultra-wide lens at the top is a great and well-thought-out move, as your finger or a tripod will never get into the frame when shooting with the ultra-wide lens. However, of course, this smartphone does have shortcomings. The biggest drawback is the stabilization. It's weak in any shooting mode on all lenses. The front camera, the main camera, while walking, while running, Oppo stabilizes video worse than anyone else. Even when centrally positioned on a tripod, even when enhanced stabilization was activated, the smartphone still exhibited significant shake. This Oppo also had issues with frame drops in nighttime shooting. They weren't as critical as with the Honor, but still noticeable. And that's definitely a drawback. Also, the Oppo's photo processing had some noticeable excesses. At 10x and 20x zoom when shooting people, it excessively enhances the image. It looks extremely unnatural, of course. What can I say about the Vivo X300 Pro? I can say that Vivo pleasantly surprised me with their video capabilities. The X300 Pro has the best stabilization on the main camera block among all three flagships. When walking, running, and in low light, the image remains quite stable and confident, and the enhanced stabilization mode is genuinely effective. Even with significant lateral shake, the X300 Pro delivers a smooth image. Vivo performed excellently in photo zoom. Day and night, the X300 Pro consistently delivers the cleanest and most precise image at high zoom levels. It handled small text and intricate details better than any other phone. Text remains readable where competitors show noise or severe distortion. This applies to video zoom as well. It's the most precise and offers the greatest zoom, up to 20x, with no exposure jumps and minimal noise. I'm noting that only the X300 Pro has 8K video. Neither Honor nor any of the others offer this feature at all. The dual recording mode was also a pleasant surprise. Vivo's implementation is the most polished. Excellent stabilization, a pleasing thumbnail design with rounded corners, and good selfie quality even in low light. The raw photo quality on the Vivo is the best of these three. Thanks to the Super RAW mode, the smartphone delivers excellent results even in low light. There's less noise, cleaner shadows, better detail retention, and bright areas are easily corrected and brought out. When it comes to other aspects, the Vivo has the lowest screen flicker among all three smartphones, which is definitely a plus for those with eyes sensitive to PWM. But the X300 Pro isn't without its drawbacks either. Portrait selfies turned out to be one of the biggest shortcomings of this flagship. The algorithms often make mistakes, leaving large objects in the background in focus. Sometimes it's a piece of an art installation in the frame, and sometimes it's the entire Burj Khalifa. You really don't want to keep photos like that as memories. There are also some oddities with the main camera block. At 10x zoom, skin is over-processed and looks unnatural, although those issues don't exist anymore on the telephoto lens at 20x. In portrait video mode and with Dolby Vision, Vivo has a serious problem with the sound. It comes out compressed and unpleasant, and this happens not always but rather randomly. I'm not confident with Vivo's performance in the sunset time-lapse either. The image turned out too dark, and noticeable noise appeared in the shadows. Other nuances include weak mobile network performance. In download speed tests, the X300 Pro noticeably lagged behind its rivals by almost 2 times, and that's despite multiple measurements. Also, the smartphone proved to be the weakest in some performance tests, although the difference from the competition wasn't too significant. Well, we've wrapped up the conclusions, and now the question, what to choose? What would I buy for myself? The Honor Magic 8 Pro? It's powerful but a very questionable device. The Oppo Find X9 Pro is generally stable, excellent for photography, with a powerful battery and an interesting design. But right now, for myself, I would choose the Vivo X300 Pro, friends. Considering the combination of all its strengths, as well as a more attractive price, this Vivo seems the most interesting of the three. What would you choose, friends? Write in the comments. And also subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. There will be even more awesome videos soon. And bye-bye to everyone.